An Airbus A320 is descending through cloud toward Hiroshima Airport at night. 81 people are on board. Ahead of the aircraft is the runway, or at least the parts of it the pilots can still make out. The captain has already made his decision. He'll continue. Then the first officer says the runway is getting invisible. Seconds later, the aircraft reaches the altitude where this approach has to become one of two things: a landing or a go-around. The automated voice calls it minimum. The captain answers, continue. Almost immediately, the first officer says the words that should end the approach. Runway not in sight. But the aircraft does not climb away. For the next few seconds, it keeps descending, low, alarmingly close to the terrain, and still moving toward a runway the crew can no longer clearly see. This is the story of Asiana Airlines Flight 162. April 14, 2015. 81 people were aboard an Airbus A320 at Incheon International Airport in South Korea that evening, preparing to depart for Hiroshima in western Japan. A flight of just over an hour. 73 of them were passengers. The remaining 8 were crew, 5 flight attendants, a boarding mechanic, and the 2 pilots who would fly them there. In the left seat was the captain, 47 years old, with more than 8,200 hours of total flying time, including over 1,300 on the Airbus A320. He was not new to Hiroshima Airport. His training record had attracted attention. Evaluators had documented concerns about rule non-compliance, a pattern that his airline had identified but not yet fully resolved. Sitting to his right was the first officer, 35 years old with just under 1,300 hours on the A320 and just shy of 1,600 hours total. His training record was clean, good assessments across recurrent training and proficiency checks, no particular comments from any evaluator. The 2 earlier legs, a shuttle to Miho Air Base in turbulence and convective weather, had left him by his own account with some fatigue before the final flight of the day had even begun. This was the 3rd flight of the day for both of them, the first 2 legs a shuttle between Incheon and a regional airbase. The 2 pilots had not flown together before. The captain had told his first officer directly, if anything concerned him at any point during their flights together, he should feel free to say so. Flight 162 pushed back from Incheon on schedule and was airborne shortly afterwards. They climbed to their cruising altitude of flight level 330, 33,000 feet. And for the next hour, the flight proceeded as normal. Ahead of them, Hiroshima was reporting low cloud and reduced visibility. In the cabin, the flight attendants had been warned to expect turbulence. For now, turbulence was all they had to worry about. During the cruise, the crew had configured the aircraft for the arrival they expected, a precision ILS approach onto runway 10 at Hiroshima, the main instrument runway, with a full ILS and nearly 900 metres of sequenced approach lighting stretching ahead the threshold. At time 1937, the aircraft began its descent toward Hiroshima. Back in the cockpit, the crew checked the latest weather, and when the ATIS came through, the first officer copied it onto the cockpit memo, the crew's written record of current conditions, the active runway, and the approach in use, and read the key figures aloud. Runway 28 was in use. The plan changed. A westerly wind had been prevailing at Hiroshima for most of the day. Approach control had been routing traffic to 28 throughout the evening, so the crew reprogrammed the flight management system for the RNAV procedure for runway 28, a GPS-based approach computed and flown by the aircraft's own navigation systems rather than by fixed ground-based radio beacons. That runway change was operationally straightforward. The briefing that followed it was not. When a crew switches to a different approach procedure in flight, the new briefing is expected to cover that procedure specifically. Its minimum altitude, its approach lighting, the terrain environment, and what the crew will do if things go wrong. The captain was expected to cover all of it. What he gave the first officer was not enough. He had made night approaches to runway 28, the same runway end they would use again tonight, on 2 previous occasions, and had arrived once to the opposite end during the day. Flight 162 will be flying an RNAV approach to runway 28. This RNAV approach is not a precision approach in the way an ILS is. The vertical path is calculated inside the aircraft's own systems from barometric altitude, the same pressure-based information used by the altimeter. That's different from an ILS, where fixed radio beams on the ground give the aircraft precise lateral and vertical guidance down toward the runway. The reason this kind of guidance is less precise than an ILS is simple. Barometric altitude is affected by the selected pressure setting, temperature, and atmospheric conditions. So the procedure puts a hard floor in the descent. The crew can follow the calculated path down to that floor, but not below it by instruments alone. At that decision point, the instrument part of the approach effectively runs out of authority. To continue below it, they need the required visual references, the approach lights, the threshold, the PAPI, the touchdown zone markings or lights, or the runway lights, not glimpsed, not assumed, held clearly enough to land. Without that specific visual confirmation, there is only one answer: go around. Runway 28 at Hiroshima is an unforgiving place to be uncertain. The airport sits on elevated terrain, roughly 1,000 feet above sea level, in a mountainous setting that closes in around the approach course. The runway itself slopes, its centre raised slightly above either end, which distorts the visual picture pilots rely on to judge height and distance in the final seconds. The approach lighting on this side is sparse, around 420 metres of simple fixed lights, compared with the long sequenced flashing system that lines the approach to the other end. And the terrain beneath the final approach course does not give way gradually. A cliff face sits on the extended centreline, just short of the threshold. There is no room on this approach for an aircraft that is lower than it should be. From the cabin, none of that geometry would have been visible. In the cockpit, it mattered a lot. Against that terrain, the procedure had built one specific safeguard, and the captain was about to remove it. The aircraft crossed the final approach fix at 3,000 feet and began its approach. Both pilots could see the runway. Coming down the final course, the aircraft tracked well laterally, and below them the lights of Hiroshima came up through thin cloud. Then, passing through roughly 2,500 feet, the captain spoke.
"The runway looks strange."
His first officer had no argument.
"Yes, a little bit awkward."
Bear in mind these words pass through two translations, Korean to Japanese, Japanese to English, but the meaning's not in doubt. Something about the picture ahead of them did not match a normal approach. Hiroshima Tower passed a wind check and an RVR reading, runway visual range, the distance a crew can see ahead along the runway surface, measured by sensors fixed to the pavement, was being monitored at 3 points: the touchdown zone, the midpoint, and the far end. At the midpoint and the far end, the figures held above 1,800 metres. At the touchdown zone, the figure was 1,700 metres and falling. The broader runway appeared workable. The one section that had to be visible, the threshold, the approach lights, the specific cues the crew needed to identify before continuing below the minimum altitude, was where the visibility was going. The ATIS included a remark about a fog bank forming to the southeast and south of the airport. That's the direction from which fog characteristically moves toward the runway 28 threshold at Hiroshima, carried up the slope by light southerly wind. The remark had not appeared on the cockpit memo. At about 2,100 feet, approximately 1,000 feet above the threshold, the captain reached a decision. The Baro VNAV standard for this approach, and the company's own procedures, required flight director or autopilot with flight director active all the way to decision altitude. The flight director would hold the computed 3-degree slope until the crew had confirmed a visual basis sufficient to take over. Without it, Maintaining that path through a degrading queue environment was something the procedure had not assumed a crew would need to do unaided. The autopilot was disengaged, and the captain switched the displays to track FPA mode. On the primary flight display, the autopilot's guidance symbology disappeared. In its place, the flight path vector, the bird, a single chevron showing present track and descent angle, nothing more. What it cannot show is whether that angle is carrying the aircraft onto the runway ahead, not whether the path is low, not what lies on the centre line between them, where it is going now. A moment later, he switched the flight director off. Manual flight from here. The first officer made the standard 1,000-foot call-out. The captain called the approach stabilised. The runway ahead was already telling them something different. The aircraft was still on the standard 3-degree path. Gradually, quietly, it began to drift below it. With the flight director off, the bird was now the instrument in front of him, showing in real time where the aircraft was pointed. The descent angle on the display looked manageable. The drift wasn't happening abruptly. A degree at a time, the descent angle deepening while the centerline held. Below the 3-degree slope, the terrain ahead was not receding at the rate the procedure assumed. It was closing. At around 1,800 feet on the altimeter, still above decision altitude, the first officer said the picture looked ambiguous. Interesting choice of words. Tonight would be his first landing on Runway 28. His only prior night arrival at Hiroshima had been to the opposite runway end on a completely different approach. Touchdown RVR had dropped to 1,300 meters. Ahead through the cloud, the Runway 28 approach lighting was somewhere in the murk. Dim behind the forming fog, shifting in and out of view. At time 20:04, with the touchdown zone reading 550 meters, the captain declared the runway in sight. He would continue. The bird showed a descent path. It could not tell them whether that path was safely carrying the aircraft to the threshold. 5 seconds later, the automated call-out came through. 100 above. 100 feet to the minimum. The first officer echoed it. The captain acknowledged. The approach continued. Seconds after that, the first officer spoke.
Getting invisible in a second.
The PAPI lights beside the runway were not continuously visible through the fog. Where they could be seen, they were already showing 1 white and 3 reds, meaning the aircraft was below the standard glide path uncorrected. Decision altitude for this approach sat at 1,500 feet, 433 feet above the Runway 28 threshold. The references it required were specific: approach lights, threshold markings, threshold lights, the PAPI, runway edge lighting, continuously identifiable at a level that let the crew judge their position and rate of change. Not a glimpse through a gap in cloud. Not a general sense of where the runway might be. Worsening conditions after the final approach fix did not suspend the requirement. Whatever remained visible through the fog was not enough to continue. The aircraft reached decision altitude. The automated call-out came through the cockpit. Minimum. The first officer echoed it immediately.
Minimum. Continue.
Below 1,000 feet, the company's own procedures were explicit. Any crew member, not only the pilot flying, not only the captain, could call for a go-around. And the pilot flying was required to comply without hesitation. The first officer was not there as a passenger. His monitoring role was a redundancy built into the system for exactly this kind of moment. He had the authority to stop it. That authority was real. It was current. It was his to use. 1 second after continue, the first officer said,
Runway not in sight.
The captain did not go around. Instead, he answered,
Wait a second.
the aircraft had crossed out of the slightly low band entirely. Around 1,400 feet, the PAPI would have been showing 4 reds where it was visible at all. 6 seconds later,
Wait a second.
the first officer did not press it further. He had been signalling concern for most of the approach. The ambiguity, the worsening picture, the way visibility was disappearing. But after that response, his attention turned to the radio altitude calls the captain wanted. The captain asked for radio altitude readings. His own company's procedures prohibited radio altitude on non-precision approaches, and the terrain beneath their approach was precisely why. The first officer called out the radio altimeter heights.
900, 800.
Then the captain made it explicit.
Keep your eye on RA. 600, 500.
Then, as the auto callouts ran, 400, 300, 200. The first officer called it again.
500.
Radio altitude is literal. It measures the aircraft's height above whatever terrain is directly underneath it. At that instant, it changes with every slope, ridge, and drop in the landscape below. The first officer's callouts were reading that height below the aircraft, not the runway threshold ahead, and not the structures now lying between the aircraft and the runway. The aircraft kept going, still below the standard 3-degree path. At time 20:05:11, the captain called it.
No runway go-around.
The go-around was initiated. The side stick came full aft. Thrust levers to toga. Takeoff go-around power. The maximum thrust setting available. A jet engine doesn't answer to full power commands instantly. From approach thrust to go-around thrust, the turbines require seconds. Unavoidable, fixed by the physics of rotating mass. The nose was already rising. The descent rate was approaching 0, but the aircraft was still moving forward, still low, and the engines were still spooling toward the power the go-around required. Ahead of the runway 28 threshold, 325 metres out along the extended centerline, stood the localizer frame stand, a steel structure 40 metres wide and 6.5 metres high, positioned exactly on the centerline. At time 20:05:14, 3 seconds after the go-around began, the pitch was rising through approximately 11 degrees nose up, engines still spooling. The aircraft struck the localizer array. Both engines, both main landing gears, the lower fuselage, the flaps, the horizontal stabilizers. The go-round was correct, but it was also too late. They crossed the threshold and came down short of the runway, on grass approximately 150 metres short of the threshold, striking approach lighting as it went. It entered the runway through the overrun and began pulling left. Brake hoses severed in the collision had left the wheel brakes largely inoperative. The left main landing gear, its downlock stay broken, was collapsing. Around 725 metres down the runway, the left engine cowl began grinding the surface, and the aircraft curved off the left side, coming to rest approximately 1,480 metres from the threshold, about 140 metres south of the centerline, just short of the airport boundary fence. Both engines had ingested structural debris, and the airframe was substantially damaged. The captain worked through the emergency evacuation checklist before leaving the cockpit. By the time he did, passengers had already left the aircraft. The cabin crew didn't wait. The purser came to the cockpit door, was told to wait, and returned to the cabin. No evacuation command came from the captain. When she heard her colleagues calling urgently from the rear and saw what appeared to be smoke, she made the call herself. She opened the forward left door, deployed the slide, and called the evacuation. The other flight attendants followed throughout the aircraft, without interphone, without PA, in a darkened cabin, on no order from the flight deck. Fire vehicles reached the aircraft around 2 minutes after it came to rest. There was no fire. Everyone made it out. 28 people were slightly injured. No fatalities. The investigation found 3 failures, layered inside a single approach. The captain crossed decision altitude with no qualifying visual references and kept going, substituting unauthorized instruments on the approach. The first officer told the captain the runway was not in sight, and didn't follow it with the go-around call that, under company procedures, the pilot flying was required to comply with without hesitation. And regarding the captain, the airline had already noted the compliance concern, documented it, and never acted on it sufficiently. Every failsafe the system had built for this moment was present. None of it was enough. There's a pattern with aviation incidents, not missing rules, but rules that existed in full and were not sufficient on their own. The Japan Transport Safety Board recommended that South Korea's Aviation Authority supervise Asiana in reinforcing procedural compliance across all flight crew and in making clear that below decision altitude, visual references lead, instruments follow. The procedure was correct, the warning was given, the note on the captain's record was written. What none of it could do was close the distance between a thing being known and a thing being done. In Hiroshima that evening, that distance was measured in seconds.